I'll write the hook and part 1 now, applying all production standards from this project. Hook, 90-110 words. The day Rosalind Avery rode into Blackwater Valley. 3 different men warned her about the same person. Not outlaws, not cattle thieves. A rancher who kept to himself. Fixed fences in the dark and hadn't fired a gun in years. He's a monster, the first man said. Killed good soldiers. Left them to rot. The second man wouldn't even say his name. The third just pointed at the ridge and crossed himself. Rosalind listened to all 3. Then she asked one question none of them could answer. Has anyone ever actually spoken to him? If you believe a quiet man deserves the truth, stay with us and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Part 1. The man everyone called a monster. Blackwater Valley, in the autumn of 1883, did not welcome strangers easily. And it did not pretend otherwise. The stage road into town was rutted deep from September rains, and the cottonwoods along Burkett Creek had gone the color of old brass. Rosalind Avery sat straight on the bench seat of the coach, her traveling bag wedged between her feet, her hands folded in her lap, the way her mother had taught her still hands. Still mine. She had left St. Louis 11 days ago. She had crossed the Missouri, the Platte, the endless rolling grass of the high plain. She had told herself she was ready. She was not entirely ready. The valley opened below the ridge like a cupped hand. Wide and brown and startlingly beautiful. Ranch houses sat at intervals along the creek. Smoke rising from chimneys, a church steeple showed white above a stand of pine. A proper town, or the beginning of one. The valley had been settled less than a decade, and it still wore that rawness, that sense of things not quite finished, not quite decided. Rosalind was coming to teach school. A small subscription fund, organized by 3 ranch families, had paid for the building's lumber and her first year's wages. She had a letter of agreement in her bag, signed by a man named Harlan Webb, who managed the valley's commercial affairs from an office above the general store. She had a trunk of school books. She had 7 years of teaching behind her, and no illusions about what frontier children were like: quick, wary, and capable of outweighting any adult who tried to force learning on them. What she did not have was any warning about what was waiting at the bottom of the ridge. The coach horses slowed as the road curved around a granite outcropping, and the driver pulled back on the reins. Rosalind leaned forward. A horse was down in the ditch alongside the road, a big gray, one foreleg folded wrong, sides heaving. Standing over it was a man. He was tall, dark-coated. He had one knee on the ground and both hands moving over the horse's leg with a slowness and deliberateness that looked almost ceremonial. The horse was not thrashing. It was watching the man's face. The coach stopped. The driver called down, "That's Ashford's animal. Let him." Lind watched. The man did not look up. He spoke to the horse in a voice too low to carry. His hands moved again, checking the leg, pressing gently. Checking again. Then he sat back on his heels and was still for a moment. Not helpless, thinking. He pulled a length of clean cloth from his coat pocket. He began to wrap the leg, slow and even, with the careful attention of someone who had done it before and understood what careless speed cost. Rosalind stepped down from the coach before the driver could protest. She walked to the edge of the ditch. Up close, the man was older than she'd estimated, 40 or thereabouts, with the kind of face that weather and silence carve into something difficult to read. A scar ran from his left temple toward his jaw, thin and pale. His eyes, when he finally raised them, were a gray blue that caught the light strangely, like creek water over slate. He looked at her. He did not look alarmed, or annoyed, or just looked. "Will he walk?" Rosalind asked. A pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer. He said, "And yes, ligament, not broken. You're certain?" "I'm certain." He went back to wrapping the leg. Rosalind crouched at the edge of the ditch. "You need help getting her up?" He stopped wrapping. He looked at her again, this time, with something that might have been curiosity. Very carefully controlled. "You know horses?" "I know enough not to stand behind one when it's frightened." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, the possibility of one. "No," he said. "I've got it." Rosalind straightened and went back to the coach. The driver gave her a look she couldn't entirely interpret, part warning, part something else. "You know who that is?" the driver asked. Low, I don't know anyone in this valley yet. Gideon Ashford, the driver, said the name like it carried weight. You'd do well to remember it and stay clear. Rosalind looked back. Ashford had gotten the horse to her feet. He was holding her bridle, speaking to her, one hand flat against her neck. He seems to be managing fine, Rosalind said. He always manages fine, the driver said. That's what makes people nervous. She heard the rest in pieces over the following 3 days. The woman who ran the boarding house, a compact, sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Garnett, delivered the first installment while showing Rosalind to her room. Blackwater Valley's a good place, Mrs. Garnett said, setting a pitcher of water on the washstand. Good people, mostly. You'll do well here if you're sensible. I intend to be. Then stay off the north end of the creek, Mrs. Garnett set her jaw. Ashford's ranch sits up there. He keeps to himself, which is all well and good, but the man has a history that doesn't sit right with decent folk. Rosalind set her traveling bag on the bed. What kind of history? Military, 15 years back. There was a massacre on the eastern border soldiers. Settlers, a whole company left in the dirt. Ashford was part of it. Some say he caused it. Mrs. Garnett lowered her voice, as though the subject itself required quiet. They called him the Blackwater Monster. He showed up here 6 years ago, bought the north parcel, and nobody has been able to move him since. Was he convicted of anything, Mrs. Garnett's expression flickered just for a moment. Well, there was some dispute about the Army's findings. Dispute meaning what? Meaning nothing was ever settled to everyone's satisfaction. She straightened the pitcher unnecessarily. But there's a kind of man who brings trouble wherever he goes. Miss Avery, and that trouble doesn't need a court ruling to be real. Rosalind thanked her for the water and said nothing else. The second installment came from Harlan Webb. He was a compact, prosperous-looking man of about 50, with the careful manners of someone who had spent years making difficult people feel comfortable. His office above the general store smelled of lamp oil and paper. He shook Rosalind's hand with both of his and offered her coffee. We're glad you've come, Webb said. The Valley's children have been without consistent instruction for 2 years. It's a gap that shows. I'm glad to fill it. Rosalind accepted the coffee. I met your Valley's most talked-about resident on my way in. Webb went still for just a moment. A practiced stillness, the kind a man develops when he wants to control a conversation's direction. Ashford. He was tending an injured horse. He seemed competent. He is competent. Webb chose his words with precision. He's also a man with a difficult past, and the families whose children you'll be teaching have strong feelings about him. I'd recommend, purely for professional reasons, keeping a certain distance. Strong feelings based on what? Exactly. Based on what happened in '68. Webb set his coffee cup down. There was an incident at a border settlement. Soldiers under fire. Civilian casualties. Ashford was a cavalry sergeant at the time. The official report was complicated. What wasn't complicated was the body count. I've heard several versions already, and I've been here less than 48 hours. That should tell you something. It tells me the story gets a great deal of circulation, Rosalind said. It doesn't tell me whether it's accurate. Webb studied her. He was not an unkind man, she thought, but he was a careful one. And careful men sometimes mistook caution for wisdom. Be that as it may, he said, Bartholomew Crane, our Valley's banker, and the man whose land loans make most of these ranches possible, feels strongly that Ashford's presence is a liability. Crane is a considerable influence here. I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't mention that. Rosalind set down her own cup. Mr. Webb, I was hired to teach children. My professional conduct has never been shaped by a banker's preferences. And I don't plan to start now, Webb nodded. Very slowly. Fair enough, Miss Avery. Fair enough. She met Bartholomew Crane on her 4th morning in the valley. He came to the schoolhouse, still half-finished, the lumber smell sharp and clean while she was arranging the desks. He was 60 or so, broad-shouldered but soft now with comfort, with white hair worn close, and a coat that had been made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He moved like a man entirely accustomed to entering rooms and being noticed. Miss Avery, he removed his hat. I hope I'm not interrupting, not at all. Can I help you? I came to welcome you personally. He smiled an excellent smile. Warm and unhurried. Bartholomew Crane. I hold most of the land notes in this valley. which gives me a particular interest in its prosperity. And a proper school is a mark of prosperity. I agree. He looked around the room with the proprietary satisfaction of a man surveying something he has paid for, even when he hasn't entirely paid for it. I also came, he said, the smile steady, because I understand you've already crossed paths with Gideon Ashford. Briefly, I want to be careful how I say this, because I'm not a man given to gossip. He turned the hat in his hand slowly, thoughtfully, but I feel a responsibility toward the women in this community, particularly women who are new here and don't yet know what I know. Rosalind waited. Ashford is dangerous. Crane's voice was quiet and entirely pleasant. Not in the way a drunk cowboy is dangerous. In the way a man who has already killed without remorse is dangerous. The army found him responsible for the deaths of 11 people in 1868. 11. And he has never once in 6 years among us offered a word of explanation or apology. Does he owe this community an explanation? Crane blinked. It was a small blink, but she caught it. He owes the families of the people who died. Was he convicted? Another small pause. The Army's findings were sufficient. Were they reviewed, Miss Avery? The smile came back, gentled. I can see you're a woman who thinks carefully. I respect that. I'm simply asking you to be cautious. For your own sake, and for the sake of the families who are trusting you with their children. Rosalind looked at him directly. Mr. Crane, I appreciate the warning. I've received several now. When I have a reason to fear Mr. Ashford, something I've witnessed myself, not something I've been told, I'll act accordingly. Crane held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, replaced his hat, and wished her a pleasant morning. He was 3 steps out the door when he turned back. One more thing, he said pleasantly. My family has been in this territory since the early days. We have long memories, and we have always found that people who make enemies of this valley's consensus tend to find things considerably more difficult than they need to be. He said it like a courtesy, like a man offering directions. Then he left. Rosalind stood in the half-finished schoolhouse and looked at the space where he'd been standing and thought, that was not a warning about Gideon Ashford. That was a warning about Bartholomew Crane. She began teaching on a Monday. 14 children, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. They came in stiff-backed and wary, the way children do when they've been told to behave and aren't sure what the consequences of not behaving will be. Rosalind had handled their kind before. She set them an arithmetic problem that was genuinely hard. Watched 3 of them lean in despite themselves, and by noon she had their attention. By the end of the first week, she had something close to their trust. It was on the 5th day that she first saw Gideon Ashford at work. She had stayed late to hang a map of the United States, a particular ritual she observed in every school she opened, because she believed that children who could see where they were in relation to everything else were children who understood they belonged to a larger world. She was standing on a chair, hammer in hand, when she heard something outside. A voice low, steady. Then the creak of wood under pressure. She climbed down and went to the window. The Tanner family's house sat at an angle from the schoolhouse, close enough to see clearly. The roof on the east side had been sagging for days. She'd noticed it. Old Emmett Tanner was past the age of climbing, and his son was working their cattle range 18 miles south. Gideon Ashford was on that roof. He had a pry bar in one hand and a bundle of new shingles beside him. He was working in the last light of the afternoon, methodical and unhurried. Below, Emmett Tanner stood in the yard with his arms crossed, saying something. Ashford listened, nodded once, and kept working. He did not look around to see who might be watching. He did not make any gesture that suggested he wanted to be seen. He fixed the roof. He came down the ladder. He exchanged a few words with the old man, picked up his tools, and left. Emmett Tanner stood in his yard for a moment after Ashford had gone. Then he took off his hat and held it against his chest. Rosalind stood at the window for a long time after that. She sought him out the following Saturday. She had thought about whether it was sensible. She had concluded that sensible was a quality she valued, but not more than she valued accuracy. She found him at the edge of the creek north of town, mending a section of fence line. He heard her coming, she was sure of that. He heard her while she was still 20 yards away, but he didn't turn until she was close. Miss Avery, he said, you know my name, Small Valley. She stopped a few feet from the fence line. I saw what you did for the Tanners. He went back to the fence wire. Roof needed fixing. Emmett Tanner didn't ask you to do it, no. Then why? He twisted a length of wire around the post with efficient, practiced movements, because it needed doing and he couldn't do it. Rosalind watched him work. He was not uncomfortable with silence. Most men felt silence as a pressure and moved to fill it. He seemed to experience it as simply the natural state of things. Everyone in this valley has told me to stay away from you, she said. You should probably do that. I don't take instructions well. He stopped working. He looked at her, not with surprise, exactly, but with something recalibrating behind his eyes. Why does everyone fear you? Rosalind asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought the conversation might be over. Because people prefer a simple story, he said at last. A man did a terrible thing. That man lives among you. The terrible thing explains everything uncomfortable you can't otherwise account for. He went back to the wire. It's tidy. And the actual story? No answer, Miss Ashford. I'm a teacher. I believe that most people, given time, can learn to tolerate a more complicated version of the truth. Was the story told about you in 1868? Is it true? He looked at her then. And the gray-blue of his eyes in the afternoon light was very still and very direct. Parts of it, he said. The parts that matter to Bartholomew Crane. That name, the way he said it. Flat. Not angry. The flatness of a man who has been patient for a very long time. What does Crane have to do with what happened in 1868? Gideon Ashford turned back to the fence and didn't answer. She waited. Then she said, You're not going to tell me. Not yet, she repeated. That implies eventually. It implies maybe. He tested the repaired section with his weight. Go home, Miss Avery. Teach your school. Stay clear of whatever Crane tells you to stay clear of. Because what he wants you to stay clear of is usually worth getting closer to. Rosalind stood for a moment longer. You know, for a monster, she said, you are terribly inconvenient. He stopped. Very still. How so, he asked. Because monsters are supposed to be easy to dislike. He was quiet for a moment. And then, brief and unexpected and entirely unguarded, he laughed. A short, real sound, like something he hadn't used in a while and had briefly forgotten he owned. He turned back to the fence. Go home, Miss Avery, she went. But she walked slowly, and she was thinking very hard. That evening, sitting at the table in her boarding house room, with her lesson book open in front of her, Rosalind did not read a single word on the page. She thought instead about what Crane had said, about what Webb had said, about what Mrs. Garnett had said. She cataloged the warnings the way she'd been trained to catalog evidence, not for what they told her, but for what they didn't. Not one of them had told her what they personally had seen Gideon Ashford do. Not one of them had named a witness who had been present in 1868. Not one of them had said the word conviction with any certainty. What they had said, collectively, was, the Army found. The report stated, people say it's known. 15 years of it's known. She thought about a man fixing a roof in the last light of an afternoon. Not looking around to see who was watching. She thought about hands wrapping a horse's leg with slow and particular care. She thought about a laugh that sounded like something a person almost never used. She thought about Bartholomew Crane turning back from the door. Things tend to get considerably more difficult than they need to be. She closed the lesson book. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and uncapped her pen. At the top of the page, she wrote a single line. What actually happened in November 1868 at the Eastern Border Settlement? Below it, she wrote, Who was the commanding officer? She looked at that question for a long time. Then she wrote one more. What is Bartholomew Crane afraid Gideon Ashford will say? She capped her pen. She looked out the window at the dark valley and the stars beginning to show above the ridge. And she felt not fear, not quite. Something more like the specific alertness of a woman who has walked into a room and realized, quietly and without drama, that the furniture has been arranged to make it difficult to find the door. She had found the door in rooms like that before. She folded the paper, put it in the inside pocket of her coat, and went to bed. Part 2, the woman who refused to believe the town. The paper she'd folded into her coat pocket that night did not stay folded long. By the following Tuesday, Rosalind had filled both sides of it and started a second sheet. The questions multiplied, the way questions always did when she pulled on a thread that no one else in a room wanted pulled. She had been a teacher long enough to know that the most important thing she could give a child was not an answer, but the habit of asking why, and not just once. Why again, why still? She applied the same habit now. Sitting at her boarding house table before dawn, with her pen and her second sheet of paper. And what she was building looked less like a list and more like a map, with several roads leading to the same unmarked point. The Army report from 1868 existed. She knew that much. Webb had referenced it. Crane had cited it. But neither man had ever read it in front of her. And neither man had produced it. They spoke about it, the way people spoke about weather as a condition of the world. Something that simply was, requiring no proof. She wrote, "Obtain the actual report." She underlined it twice and went to teach school. The children were restless that morning. A cold front had come through overnight. And the smell of winter in the air did something to young people that it also did to horses and dogs. It wound them tight. Rosalind redirected 3 arguments. Settled a dispute about a missing pencil that turned out not to be missing at all. And spent 40 minutes on state geography because it was the one subject that reliably turned the room quiet. She put her finger on Wyoming on the map and asked who could tell her what lay to the north. "Montana Territory," said a girl in the second row named Lucy Garfield. Lucy was 11 and possessed the particular sharpness of a child who had been underestimated so consistently that she'd turned it into fuel. And to the East Dakota Territory, a boy named Pete Sorensen, who sat in the back and tried to look as though he wasn't paying attention. He was always paying attention. Good. And if I stood in eastern Wyoming in 1868 and rode toward the border of Dakota Territory, what was out there? The room went quiet in a different way. Lucy Garfield looked up from her slate. "That's where the trouble was," she said carefully. "With the soldiers. What do you know about it?" The children exchanged glances, that rapid, sideways communication that children used when they were deciding whether an adulter could lead to unedited version. "Papa says a soldier went bad out there," Pete Sorensen offered. "Killed people who trusted him." Which silence. "Mr. Ashford," Lucy said finally. Her voice was not cruel. It was the voice of a child repeating something she'd been told so many times it had become simple fact. The way the sky was blue and the creek ran south. "They say he went bad. Who told your parents that?" Another exchange of glances. Then Lucy said very honestly, "I don't know. I think everyone just knows. Everyone just knows." Rosalind nodded and moved the lesson forward, but the phrase sat in her chest the rest of the afternoon, like a stone she couldn't stop feeling. Everyone just knows, the most dangerous 4 words in any community. The words that had convicted men without trials and silenced women without cause and buried truth so deep in the comfort of consensus that even the people who originally buried it forgot there was anything underneath. She stayed after the children left and stood at the map for a long time. She put her finger on the eastern border of Wyoming Territory. She thought about a sergeant in 1868, young, stationed at the edge of the world. And she thought about what it would take for a man to accept 15 years of being called a monster without offering a single word of defense. It would take something worth protecting. The question was what? She was still at the map when she heard boots on the porch step, and the door opened and Gideon Ashford stood in the schoolhouse doorway with a bucket of fresh whitewash in one hand and a brush in the other. He stopped when he saw her. Clearly he had expected the room to be empty. "I can come back," he said. "The exterior wall on the north side?" Rosalind asked. He blinked just slightly. "I noticed it was bare wood," she said. "It'll rot faster without a coat. The Webb family promised to see to it and haven't." "Were you going to do it without asking anyone?" A pause. "The wood won't wait for permission. It also won't wait for you to be embarrassed about being caught doing a kindness." She picked up her coat from the chair. "I'll hold the bucket." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who was entirely unaccustomed to being managed and wasn't sure what the correct response was. "I don't need help," he said. "No, but you have it." She walked past him onto the porch. After a moment, she heard him follow. They worked for nearly an hour without much talk. He was methodical, long, even strokes, no waste. She held the bucket and watched the bare gray wood disappear under white, and thought about how to ask what she needed to ask without giving him an obvious reason to leave. "The children know your name," she said finally. His brush kept moving. "Small Valley. They know the story too. The version that's been told to them. I'd expect so. It doesn't bother you." He finished a section before he answered. "What they know now isn't what they'll know in 10 years. Kids ask better questions than their parents. One of them asked me this afternoon why everyone just knows something, without anyone having seen it." The brush stopped. "Lucy Garfield," Rosalind said. "She's 11 and she's going to be formidable in about 5 years." He started working again. But something had shifted in the set of his shoulders, a loosening. Very slight. The kind that happened when a man encountered something he hadn't expected, and it landed somewhere unguarded. Her father was one of the men Crane convinced to sign the petition, he said. "What petition?" He was quiet, Mr. Ashford. 3 years ago. Crane circulated a petition to the Territorial Land Office, he said. He wanted my north parcel reviewed for improper claim. Said I hadn't met the continuous use requirement, had you? I'd been working that land for 6 years. Then what happened? Nothing. The land office reviewed it and dismissed the petition. He moved down the wall. But 4 families signed it. Garfield was one of them. Not because they believed I'd broken any law. Because Crane asked them to and they owe him money. That landed hard. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. How much does Crane want that parcel? More than he's willing to say in public. He dipped the brush. The valley's going to get a railroad spur in the next 3 or 4 years. The route runs through the north end of the creek. My land sits across the only viable approach. There it was. The piece she hadn't had until now. The map in her head rearranged itself. Road shifting, the unmarked point moving into clarity. So you're not just an inconvenient man with an inconvenient history, she said. You're an inconvenient landowner blocking a railroad. Crane's been patient. He's been waiting for me to sell or leave or give him a reason to force the issue. And the monster story is the reason. He turned then and looked at her straight. The gray afternoon light was fading, and his face in it was tired, in a way she hadn't seen before, not the tiredness of a single day, but the kind that had been building for years without adequate rest. I built this town a reason to want me gone, he said. Before I ever arrived. 15 years of it circulating. And then I show up and the story's already here waiting. Who started it circulating again recently? She already suspected. But she wanted to hear him say it. He turned back to the wall. Ask Crane what his father's name was. She let that sit. Wyatt Crane, she said, because she had done enough asking in the past week that she already knew. He was a colonel. He commanded the eastern border garrison in 1867 and 1868. Gideon did not answer. The order that sent soldiers into that settlement, was it his order? Silence. But it was the specific silence of a man who knew the answer and was deciding whether the deciding had finally arrived. Mr. Ashford, Rosalind said quietly, I'm not asking for your protection. I'm not asking you to fight a battle. I'm asking whether the story being told about you in this valley is a lie constructed by the son of the man who actually gave the order that caused those deaths. The brush stopped entirely. The wind off the ridge pushed against the schoolhouse wall. Somewhere down the creek a horse called out, and another answered. Gideon Ashford set the brush across the top of the bucket. He turned and faced her fully. Yes, he said, one word. After 15 years of silence, one word. Flat and final and carrying the weight of everything that had been built on top of it. Rosalind held his gaze. She did not flinch and she did not rush to fill the air. Then there are people still living who were in that settlement, she said. Some. And they know what actually happened. They know. Then why she stopped. Recalibrated. You've protected them. That's why you haven't spoken. Because if you gave the full account, it would lead back to Wyatt Crane's order. And Bartholomew Crane would make their lives. He already made their lives difficult, Gideon said. 2 families from that settlement ended up in this territory. Crane's been holding their land notes for 4 years. The cold moved through Rosalind in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Bartholomew Crane wasn't just silencing Gideon Ashford. He was holding the witnesses hostage. She looked at the man in front of her, the man everyone in this valley had told her was dangerous, and she thought, He has been carrying this alone for 15 years. And he intends to keep carrying it, because the alternative costs other people more than it costs him. Who are they? She asked. The families. No. His voice was not hard. It was final in the way of a door that has been considered and deliberately closed. That's not something I'll give you. I could find out myself. You probably could. He picked up the brush. Don't. She stood at the edge of the porch. The first star was showing above the eastern ridge, pale and early in the gray sky. You said earlier that parts of the 1868 story were true, she said. The parts that matter to Crane. What parts are those? He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, not softer, but stripped of everything careful and considered, as though he had finally reached the bottom of something. 11 people died, he said. That part's true. 7 soldiers and 4 settlers from the border camp. The report says I failed to hold the line and caused a retreat that left them exposed. Did you fail to hold the line? I broke it, he said. Deliberately. Because Wyatt Crane's order was to hold position while the settlers were inside the camp perimeter and under fire from 3 sides. If I'd held that line, all 4 of them would have died where they stood, and we'd have called it a defense of position. I broke the line and got them out. 7 soldiers died in the movement. The weight of it was immense. Rosalind felt it. 7 soldiers died because you moved to save 4 civilians. 7 soldiers died because a colonel gave an order that treated 4 civilian lives as acceptable losses, and the report blamed you. The report described an unauthorized breach of defensive position resulting in catastrophic casualties. His voice was entirely steady. Every word of it is technically accurate. None of it is the truth. Rosalind put her hand against the schoolhouse wall, the wall he had just whitewashed. The wall that was clean and white and would last through winter now. Wyatt Crane is dead, she said. Yes. But Bartholomew Crane has the report and knows what it says, and knows that as long as you won't speak. It says everything and explains nothing. That's correct. And if I found the families... Don't. He picked up the bucket. Miss Avery, I know what you're thinking. I know the shape of the thing you're building. But those families have children too. That stopped her. Crane won't touch a teacher, he continued. You're too visible. Too new. The town wants to think well of itself, and harming a schoolteacher is the kind of thing that a town cannot do and still think well of itself. But the Harlow family has been here 4 years, and they walk a line every single day. I won't give Crane a reason to shorten it. Rosalind was quiet. Then the Harlow family. He looked at her, and she watched him realize very slowly. Because it was not a thing he was practiced at recognizing that she had just done to him exactly what he had just done to himself. He had given her a name without meaning to, because a man who has been silent for 15 years sometimes forgets the weight of a single detail. You did that deliberately, he said. No, you gave me that without trying. She met his eyes. Which means some part of you is ready for someone else to know. He stood very still. She had seen him still before, but this was different, not the stillness of a man comfortable with silence, but the stillness of a man at the edge of a decision that cannot be walked back. Go home, Miss Avery, he said at last. You keep saying that. You keep not going. She almost smiled. Good night, Mr. Ashford. She walked home through the cold evening air, with the name Harlow tucked safely in her mind, and the understanding, clear and uncomfortable and entirely energizing, that she had just become part of something that Bartholomew Crane would not like at all. She was not afraid of that. She found, examining herself honestly as she walked, that she was something closer to ready. The second sheet of paper was waiting on her table. She sat down, uncapped her pen, and wrote the name at the top. Harlow family, 4 years in the valley. Land note held by B. Crane, present at Eastern Border Settlement, November 1868. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote below it. They saw what Gideon Ashford did, and they have been paying for that knowledge ever since. She set the pen down. She thought about Gideon Ashford, standing in a broken defensive line in the dark of a November night in 1868, with 7 men dying around him, and 4 civilians running for their lives. And she thought about the 15 years he had spent afterwards, being called a monster for it. And something moved in her chest that was more than sympathy and less than pity and considerably more complicated than either. She capped the pen and went to the window and looked out at the valley dark under the stars. Whatever Bartholomew Crane was afraid of, he had reason to be. She was going to find the Harlow family. The question was how to do it without Crane seeing her before she got there. Because a man who held land notes and circulated petitions and smiled like a deacon, while he said things tend to get considerably more difficult, was a man who watched carefully and moved quickly when he felt threatened. She needed to get there first. She needed to get there without looking like she was going anywhere in particular. She had 14 children. 3 of them rode in from north of the creek road every morning. And a teacher who wanted to understand her students' home situations, who wanted to make sure the valley's more distant families felt included in the school's work. A teacher who visited homes was not doing anything remarkable. Teachers visited homes. It was expected. It was exactly the kind of thing a new teacher would do in her first weeks. Eager to make a good impression, Rosalind went to bed that night with something that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like a plan. She was asleep before 9 o'clock and dreamed of nothing. Wednesday, she visited the Sorensen place Pete's family, who lived east of town. Thursday, she visited the Breckenridge farm. She brought small things, a copy of an arithmetic worksheet, a note about an upcoming recitation. She sat in kitchens and drank coffee and listened to parents talk about their children with the particular mixture of pride and bafflement that parents everywhere wore. She asked questions. The kinds of questions teachers asked. Where had they come from before the valley? How long had the family been in Wyoming? Did they have relatives elsewhere in the territory? And on Friday afternoon, she rode north along the creek road, borrowed horse from the livery, her good coat, her teacher's bag, and knocked on the door of the Harlow house. A woman opened it, 40-something, dark-haired, with capable hands and careful eyes. She took in Rosalind's coat and bag, and her expression shifted through several things before settling on something neutral and waiting. Mrs. Harlow? I'm Rosalind Avery. I'm the new teacher. I know who you are. Her voice was not unfriendly, but it was watchful. Daniel and May are my 2. Good students, they are. May I come in? Brief but real. Yes, the woman said. Come in. Her name was Catherine Harlow. Her husband, Frank, was out checking fence. The 2 children, Daniel, 9, and May, 7, were visible through the doorway doing something with a cat and a length of string that was absorbing most of their attention. Rosalind sat at the table and accepted coffee and talked about the children. Honestly and specifically, because they were genuinely good students and she meant everything she said. Catherine Harlow listened and watched and remained careful. After 20 minutes, in the middle of a sentence about May's particular gift for arithmetic, Catherine Harlow put her coffee cup down and said, very quietly, you've been talking to Gideon Ashford. Rosalind did not flinch. Yes. How much did he tell you? That your family was at the eastern border settlement in 1868. Catherine's face did not change, but her hands, flat on the table, pressed down very slightly, the gesture of a person steadying themselves. We don't talk about that, she said. I know. I think you've been very careful not to talk about it for 4 years. Because Bartholomew Crane holds your land note, and you understand exactly what that means. The silence was dense. Miss Avery, Catherine's voice was low. You are new here. You do not fully understand what you are asking. I understand that a man has been carrying a false account of what he did for 15 years in order to protect people who were there, Rosalind said. I understand that the man who spread that account benefits enormously from it. And I understand that the truth has witnesses. She held the woman's gaze. I'm not asking you to do anything today. I'm not asking you to speak publicly or sign anything or confront anyone. I'm asking you one question and then I'll leave. Catherine waited. Was Gideon Ashford responsible for those deaths? Catherine Harlow looked at her for a long moment. The children laughed at something in the next room. Outside, a horse moved in the yard, Frank returning. No, Catherine Harlow said. He was the only reason any of us lived. Rosalind let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Thank you, she said. She stood and picked up her bag. It won't be enough, Catherine said quietly. Just me saying it. Crane has the report. He has lawyers in Cheyenne. He has the bank. Her voice was not hopeless, but it was very honest. What does one woman's word count against all of that? Rosalind buttoned her coat. In my experience, she said, it counts considerably more than the people who wrote the report expected. She moved toward the door. Mrs. Harlow, when your children came to school this week, did you notice anything different about them? Catherine frowned slightly. They seemed lighter. May said the teacher let them ask whatever they wanted. I did. Rosalind opened the door. I intend to keep doing that. She walked to her horse. She heard the door close behind her. She rode back down the creek road in the fading afternoon, with the cold wind at her back and something solid and certain settling in her chest. One witness who would say yes privately was not a courtroom victory. But it was the first stone placed in the correct position, and she had built enough walls, literal and otherwise, to know that structure followed from the first stone. Always, if you kept your hand steady and your eye on what you were building toward. She did not see Gideon Ashford on the road back, but when she passed the north end of his fence line, she noticed a fresh post set that hadn't been there that morning, tamped solid in the cold ground, with the wire strung clean and taut between it and the next. She thought, he keeps fixing things. He keeps building. In spite of everything, she thought about what Catherine Harlow had said. He was the only reason any of us lived. And she thought, very quietly and with a clarity that arrived before she was entirely ready for it, this man has spent 15 years believing his silence was a gift to others. He has never once considered that it might also be a cage. The valley spread out around her, brown and cold, and going gold at the edges where the sun was hitting the ridge. 14 children who asked better questions than the adults expected. One woman who would say the truth privately. One man who did not yet understand that someone had decided, without particularly announcing it, to refuse to leave him inside the cage alone. She rode through the last of the afternoon light and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full scale of what she was intending. Then she put her chin down against the wind and rode on. Part 3, The Truth Hidden for 15 Years. Catherine Harlow's words did not leave Rosalind alone. She was the only reason any of us lived. One sentence, spoken quietly in a kitchen, with children laughing in the next room. And it had rearranged everything. Rosalind thought she understood about the shape of what she was dealing with. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a community that had drawn the wrong conclusion from incomplete evidence and would correct itself when better evidence arrived. This was a structure deliberately built, carefully maintained, with a banker at the center of it holding the financial lives of witnesses in one hand and a corrupted army report in the other. Structures like that did not fall from one woman saying the truth privately. She knew that. She was not naive about it. But she also knew from 7 years of teaching children who had been told they were slow, told they were difficult, told they would never learn that structures built on lies had a particular vulnerability that structures built on truth did not. They required constant maintenance. Every person who knew the lie had to keep choosing it every day, and that choosing cost something. It wore on people. It showed up in the places a careful observer knew to look. She was a careful observer. The following Monday, Bartholomew Crane sent her flowers. They arrived at the schoolhouse before the children did a proper arrangement, wrapped in paper left on the porch step with a card in his handwriting. To welcome you properly to our valley. With my sincere regards, B. Crane. Rosalind looked at them for a long moment, then brought them inside and put them on her desk. Because they were flowers, and the children would like them. And she was not going to give Crane the satisfaction of seeing them discarded. Lucy Garfield noticed them immediately. Who sent those, Mr. Crane, the banker? Lucy's nose wrinkled. It was an involuntary expression, honest and quick, and Rosalind filed it away. Even an 11-year-old felt something wrong about it. Papa says Mr. Crane is the most important man in the valley, Lucy said. Your papa may be right about his importance, Rosalind said. Now open your reader to page 41. That afternoon, Harlan Webb stopped her on the road between the schoolhouse and the boarding house. He fell into step beside her with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to make impositions feel casual. I hear you've been making home visits, Webb said. I have. It's standard practice. North end of the creek road. She kept walking. Among other places, Miss Avery. He lowered his voice, though the road was empty in both directions. I want to be plain with you, because I think you're an intelligent woman and plain speaking suits you better than hints. Bartholomew Crane has been patient with Ashford for years. And that patience is running out. Whatever you're building between yourself and that man and I can see something is building. It is going to draw fire that you are not prepared for. What kind of fire? The kind that ends teaching careers, Webb said. The kind that makes references unavailable and letters of character impossible to obtain. The kind that closes doors in cities you haven't even considered yet. Rosalind stopped walking. She turned to face him fully. Mr. Webb, are you threatening me on Crane's behalf? Or are you warning me on your own? He was quiet for a moment. And in that moment she saw something shift in his face, not guilt. Exactly, but the close relative of it. The expression of a man who had told himself a comfortable story for a long time and had just felt it develop a crack. I'm trying to keep you from making a costly mistake, he said at last. What would it cost me to know the truth about 1868? He looked away. Down the road, toward the ridge. More than you currently understand, he said. And walked on. She watched him go. Then she walked the rest of the way to the boarding house, thinking that Webb was not a bad man. He was a man who had made accommodations so gradually that he had forgotten what he had originally accommodated. The valley was full of people like him, and she was not angry with them. But she was not going to mistake their discomfort for wisdom. She had a meeting to arrange, and she needed to arrange it before Crane understood exactly where her visits had been leading. She wrote a note that evening and folded it twice and addressed it in her most ordinary handwriting, the handwriting she used for attendance sheets. Not correspondence. She gave it to Pete Sorensen the next morning, with instructions to leave it at the Harlow fence post on his way in from the North Road. The note said, I need to speak with your husband. Not at your home. The schoolhouse, after 5, when the children are gone. Tell no one. She taught Tuesday and Wednesday with the specific focused attention of someone who is waiting for something and has decided not to waste the waiting. She taught long division and the names of the presidents and the proper formation of a compound sentence. And she did it well because these children deserved her full attention, regardless of what was happening outside the classroom walls. On Wednesday evening, Frank Harlow came to the schoolhouse. He was a lean, weathered man in his mid-40s, with the permanent squint of someone who had spent years reading distance. He sat in the chair across from her desk without taking his hat off, which was not rudeness but the habit of a man who was ready to leave at any moment. Catherine said, You were at the house last Friday, he said. I was. I want to thank you both for receiving me. She told you what she told you. His voice was careful. Not hostile, but careful in the way of a man who had learned that the wrong word in the wrong place could cost him his land. I want to know what you intend to do with it. I intend to find out if there are other witnesses, Rosalind said. And I intend to find the actual Army report, not Crane's version of it, but the original, filed with the Territorial Records Office in Cheyenne. He was quiet. Your family was in that settlement, she said. You were there. You saw what Gideon Ashford did, and you saw what Colonel Crane's order did. And for 4 years you've been in this valley, carrying that knowledge. With Crane holding your note. He holds it at 6%, Frank said. Which is 2 points below what anyone else in this territory would charge me. That's not generosity. That's a leash. Something passed across Frank Harlow's face, not surprise. But the particular expression of a man hearing said aloud the thing he has known privately for years and has been careful not to say himself. What do you want from me? He asked. I want to know whether there are other survivors from that settlement who are still living. Anyone who saw what happened that night. He studied his hat brim. A long moment. There's a man named Edmund Goss, he said finally. He was a civilian supply agent with the camp. He hasn't lived in Wyoming since '72. Last I heard he was in Laramie, running a dry goods operation. Rosalind's pen was already moving. Goss, Laramie. He's not going to come up here voluntarily. Crane's reach goes as far as Laramie. What if he didn't have to come here? Frank looked up. What do you mean, a written account? Witnessed and notarized. A sworn statement describing what he saw on the night of November 14th, 1868. She held his gaze. Crane can suppress a person. He cannot suppress a notarized document filed with the territorial court. The room was very quiet. You've thought about this carefully, Frank said. I've thought about almost nothing else for 10 days. He turned his hat in his hands slowly. Deliberately, the same gesture she had seen Crane use in the schoolhouse, but carrying a completely different weight. Crane's gesture was performance. Frank Harlow's was genuine deliberation. Crane will move against us the moment he suspects, Frank said. He'll call the note. Early payment in full. Can you meet it? No, then we move before he suspects. And we move quickly. She watched the decision happen behind his eyes, not quickly. Not easily, but genuinely. The decision of a man who had been carrying something heavy for 4 years and was now being offered a set of hands willing to take some of the weight. I'll write to Goss, Frank said. Write today. Tell him everything. Tell him what we need. He nodded once and stood and settled his hat. Miss Avery. He paused at the door. Gideon Ashford doesn't know you're doing this. No. He won't thank you for it, I know. Frank Harlow looked at her for a moment longer. He saved my family, he said, my wife, my children, who weren't born yet but would never have been born if not for what he did that night. I have wanted to say that out loud, in public, with my name attached, for 4 years. His voice was steady, but something in it was close to breaking. You're giving me the chance to do it. She did not say anything. There were moments when speaking added nothing. He left. She sat at the desk in the empty schoolhouse and looked at the name she had written. Edmund Goss Laramie. Then she looked at what she'd written beside it. Sworn statement, territorial court. It would take time. Letters moved slowly. Goss might refuse. Frank might lose his nerve. Any one of a dozen things might go wrong before a single document reached anyone who could use it. But it had begun, and beginnings mattered. She did not know, as she walked home that night, that Bartholomew Crane's foreman had been sitting on a horse in the trees north of the schoolhouse for the past 40 minutes. She did not know that he had watched Frank Harlow walk in and walk out again. She did not know that within 2 hours of Frank's visit, Crane would know that the Harlow situation had become unstable. She found out 3 days later. The first sign was the letter. It came to the boarding house, addressed to Rosalind in a clean commercial hand Crane's offices. The return. She opened it at the breakfast table. It was a brief, cordial note. Mr. Crane wished to inform her that he had taken the liberty of speaking with the Valley's school subscription committee regarding her contract, and that several members had raised concerns about certain conduct they considered inappropriate for a woman in her position, specifically the making of unsolicited visits to family homes and the apparent cultivation of relationships with persons of questionable community standing. He remained, of course, her most sincere admirer and hoped she would see fit to address the committee's concerns directly. He would be happy to facilitate a meeting at her earliest convenience. Rosalind read it twice. She set it beside her coffee cup. Mrs. Garnett, clearing the table, glanced at the Crane letterhead. Her expression was carefully neutral, in the way of a woman who has learned to be invisible when important things are happening. Trouble? Mrs. Garnett asked. Pressure, Rosalind said. There's a difference. She went to school. She taught. She did not change a single thing about her day. That evening, she went to find Gideon Ashford. She had not sought him out since the night at the schoolhouse fence. She had been deliberate about that, giving him space, moving carefully, not drawing Crane's attention to the connection between them before she had something solid in hand. But Crane already knew. The letter made that plain. The time for careful distance was over. She found him at his ranch. The front door opened before she finished knocking. He had heard her on the path, which she was beginning to accept as simply a feature of the man. He looked at her, then past her at the dark road. Come in, he said. She came in. The main room was spare and clean, with a work table along one wall and a fireplace that was doing serious work against the October cold. He had been writing something, papers spread on the table, a pen laid across them. She did not look closely. She handed him the Crane letter. He read it. His face did not change, but something in his posture did, a tightening along the jaw. Very controlled. He moved faster than I expected, he said. He has someone watching the schoolhouse. He looked up from the letter. Frank Harlow came to see me Wednesday evening, she said. Crane's man was in the trees. He set the letter on the table. Very carefully. The care of a man controlling something. You went to the Harlows, he said. Yes, I told you not to. You did. She met his eyes steadily. And I understood why you said it. And I went anyway. Because you have been making other people's decisions for them for 15 years. And it hasn't protected anyone, it's just kept Crane comfortable. The silence was sharp-edged. Frank is writing to Edmund Goss in Laramie, she continued. He was a civilian supply agent at the settlement in 1868. Frank believes he'll give a sworn statement. Gideon stood very still. She watched him absorb it, the fact of it, the enormity of it. The thing he had spent 15 years ensuring would never happen. You had no right, he said. Frank Harlow is a grown man who made his own decision. You put him in Crane's sight. He was already in Crane's sight. He's been in Crane's sight since the day he arrived in this valley. She took a step forward. Gideon. He told me he has wanted to say the truth out loud. With his name on it for 4 years. You have been protecting people who are capable of deciding whether they want to be protected. He turned away from her. Toward the fireplace. His hands went flat on the mantel, and he stood like that for a moment, not angry. Or not only angry, but something more complicated that she did not have a word for yet. If Goss refuses, he said, then we find another way. And if Crane calls Frank's note before the document reaches court, Frank knows the risk. He accepted it. Gideon pushed off the mantel and faced her. His eyes in the firelight were very direct. Why, he asked. Not why, Frank, why you? You came here to teach school. You had no part in any of this. You could walk away from this whole thing tomorrow and go back to St. Louis, and your life would be exactly what it was. Rosalind looked at him. Would yours? She said. He had no answer for that. I am not doing this for you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I am doing it because in 14 years of teaching, I have never once let a lie stand in my classroom when I had the means to address it. This valley is not my classroom, but it is where my children live. And they are learning every day from what the adults around them choose to do and choose not to do. She kept her voice even. And yes, also for you. Because you did something brave and specific and no one has ever said so. He looked away. I know you don't need it. That's not the point. She picked up her coat from the chair where she dropped it. Crane is going to move quickly now. He'll go after my contract first. Then the Harlows. We need the Goss letter before he boxes us in. She moved toward the door. He didn't move to stop her, but he spoke Rosalind. It was the first time he had used her first name. The word landed differently than she expected, not casual. Nothing like casual. The weight of a man who had been very careful with names for a very long time. She stopped, did not turn around immediately, gave herself one breath. Then she turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not yet seen on him, not the controlled flatness, not the grim patience. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been there longer than the scar and the silence. Something that looked like a man who has been standing in the cold so long he has forgotten what warmth felt like and has just been reminded. Be careful, he said. I intend to be. That's not what I mean. He paused. Crane has never gone after a woman directly. But there's a first time for everything when a man feels cornered. She held his gaze. Good, corner him further. She went out into the cold. She heard the door close behind her. She walked back down the road to town, with her hands in her pockets and her thoughts moving quickly. And she did not let herself think about the way he had said her name. Because there was too much work left, and she could not afford the distraction. The letter from Edmund Goss arrived 11 days later. Frank Harlow brought it himself, rode into town at 7 in the morning, and knocked on the boarding house door before Mrs. Garnett had finished her first pot of coffee. He was still wearing his riding coat, and his boots were muddy, and his expression was the concentrated look of a man carrying something fragile over rough ground. Rosalind read the letter at the breakfast table, with Frank standing beside her and Mrs. Garnett finding sudden urgent business in the far corner of the room. Goss wrote plainly. He was 63 years old. He had been at the eastern border settlement on the night of November 14th, 1868, in his capacity as civilian supply agent to the garrison. He stated clearly, specifically, with dates and names, that Colonel Wyatt Crane had issued orders at approximately 9 o'clock that evening to hold defensive position and to disregard the civilians inside the camp perimeter. He stated that Sergeant Gideon Ashford had disobeyed that order and moved to extract the civilians under fire. and that this action had directly saved 4 lives. He stated that the subsequent Army report had characterized Ashford's action as dereliction of duty, and that this characterization was false. He closed by saying that he had been silent for 15 years out of fear of professional and financial consequences, and that he was prepared to be silent no longer. He had already arranged to have a notarized version of this statement filed with the Territorial Court Office in Laramie. Rosalind read it 3 times. Then she set it on the table. "It's already filed," she asked. "He says so." Frank's voice was careful, as if he was afraid of disturbing something. He sent a copy of the court filing receipt with the letter. "It's in the envelope." She pulled out the second sheet. There it was, a court receipt, stamped and dated 9 days ago. It was already done, before they had received his letter. Before Crane had any chance to intervene, Edmund Goss, 63 years old in Laramie, had filed his sworn statement with the Territorial Court 9 days ago, and Bartholomew Crane did not yet know it existed. He moved fast, Frank said. He was ready. Rosalind held the receipt carefully. He has been ready for years. He was just waiting for someone to ask. Frank looked at the letter on the table. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were bright in the way of a man controlling something large. "What do we do now?" he asked. She thought about Crane's letter. The school committee. The pressure already building. The man in the trees behind the schoolhouse. Now she said, "We show this to Gideon." Frank nodded. "He won't be pleased that you went around him." "No." She folded the letter back into the envelope. "But he hasn't been pleased about much for 15 years. And I think he can manage one more morning of it." She was already putting on her coat. Frank put a hand on the doorframe. "Miss Avery, when this is over, if it goes the way we need it to go, what happens to Crane?" She paused with her coat half buttoned. "He loses the one thing he's been using to control this valley," she said. "The story. Without the story, he's just a banker with land notes and a family name. And land notes can be paid off. And Gideon?" She finished buttoning her coat. "He gets his name back," she said simply. She opened the door. The morning was cold and bright, and the valley lay out ahead of her in the early light. And she walked into it, carrying an envelope that contained 15 years of suppressed truth and the clear, specific notarized account of a 63-year-old man in Laramie who had decided he was done being afraid. What she did not yet know, what none of them knew, was that Crane's foreman had intercepted Frank Harlow on the road outside of town, had seen the envelope, had not opened it, but had seen it, and had ridden to Crane's house before Rosalind had finished her second cup of coffee. By the time she reached Gideon's ranch with Frank Harlow behind her and the Goss letter in her coat pocket, Bartholomew Crane was already sitting at his desk, composing something. He was not composing a letter. He was composing a legal filing. He had made a decision. He was done being patient. He was done with indirect pressure and flower arrangements and polite warnings delivered through third parties. If the Harlow family was going to break ranks, he would accelerate. If Miss Avery was going to insert herself into a business that did not concern her, he would make it concern her in ways she had not anticipated. He knew something that Rosalind did not yet know, something he had held in reserve for exactly this kind of moment, something that had nothing to do with the 1868 report. It was a document, signed old, and it was going to change everything. He picked up his pen and began to write. Part 4. The cowboy who wanted to leave Gideon read the Goss letter standing up. He did not sit. He did not ask to read it twice. He went through it once. Slowly, with the particular stillness of a man receiving news he has spent 15 years believing would never arrive. And when he reached the bottom of the page, he set it on the table and looked at the wall for a long moment without speaking. Frank Harlow stood near the door. Rosalind stood between them. The fire had burned low and no one moved to add wood. "He filed it already," Gideon said. 9 days ago." Rosalind kept her voice even. "Before we even received his letter. It's in the Territorial Court record in Laramie. Crane cannot touch it now." Gideon looked at the court receipt. He picked it up, held it, set it down again. His hands were entirely steady, which told her more than shaking would have. "Edmund Goss," he said quietly. "I haven't heard that name in 12 years. "He remembers yours," Frank said from the door. Something crossed Gideon's face, brief and unguarded, and gone before she could fully read it. Not relief. Something older than relief. The expression of a man who has been braced against a weight for so long that when part of it lifts, the absence is almost disorienting. He'll face consequences for this, Gideon said. He's aware. Rosalind moved toward the table. He's 63 years old and he runs a dry goods operation that he owns outright. He wrote that Crane's reach in Laramie is real but not unlimited, and that a notarized court filing is considerably harder to suppress than a man's silence. Crane will try. Let him try. She held his gaze. The document exists. It's dated. It's witnessed. Whatever Crane does now, the record is there. Gideon turned away from the table. He walked to the window, not looking out, just moving. The way a man moved when thought required motion. He has something else, Gideon said. I know him. He wouldn't have let his foreman sit in those trees watching your schoolhouse unless he was already building towards something. The Goss letter matters, but it's not what he's moving with. There's something else. Frank and Rosalind exchanged a look. What could he have? Frank asked. I don't know. Gideon turned back. But I know that man's patience. He's been easily 6 years waiting for me to leave voluntarily. He would not give that up and go aggressive unless he had something in hand he believed was enough to finish it. The room went quiet. Rosalind thought about Crane at his desk that morning, the image she'd constructed from fragments. The man composing something that was not a letter. She thought about what Frank had said on the ride over. Crane has always known more than he shows. Whatever it is, she said. We need to get ahead of it. The Goss statement is in the record. Now we need people in this valley to know it exists. How? Frank asked. The town meeting. Rosalind had been thinking about this since the boarding house that morning. Harlan Webb chairs a monthly meeting of the valley's landowners. The next one is Thursday. Crane will be there, Frank said. Yes, that's the point. Both men looked at her. We don't give him time to deploy whatever he's holding, she said. We bring the Goss statement to that meeting ourselves. Frank reads it aloud. Every landowner in this valley hears what Edmund Goss witnessed on November 14th, 1868. Every one of them hears the name Wyatt Crane attached to the order that actually caused those deaths. She paused. Crane cannot suppress what 40 people have already heard with their own ears. Frank's jaw tightened. He'll call my note the morning after. Possibly. But I've already written to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, requesting a review of all land notes in this valley, held by a single creditor. She watched Frank's expression shift. It's a legitimate request. A creditor holding more than 60% of a valley's land notes represents a monopoly on financial leverage that the territorial government has reason to examine. Frank stared at her. When did you do that? 6 days ago. Before the Goss letter even arrived. I wanted to have it in motion before we needed it. She kept her voice matter-of-fact. Because the situation required steadiness, not drama. Crane can call your note, but if the territorial office is already examining his holdings, a sudden aggressive call on a compliant debtor looks like exactly what it is: retaliation. That is not a position a banker wants to be in with the territorial government. The fire snapped. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted in the yard. Gideon was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the recalibrating look from the fence line, not the guarded thing from the window at dusk. Something more stripped down than either of those. A man looking at something he had not anticipated and wasn't sure what to do with. You've been building this for weeks, he said. Since the night I wrote down your name on a piece of paper, she said. Yes, without telling me. You would have stopped me. I would have tried. I know. She did not look away from him. Which is why I didn't tell you. He was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. I don't need you to fight for me, he said. She had expected that. She had prepared for it, because she knew the shape of his pride, not arrogance, but the self-sufficiency of a man who had survived 15 years alone by needing nothing from anyone. I know you don't need it, she said, but the children in my classroom needed me to fight for the truth. And the Harlow family needed someone who wasn't in Crane's debt. And this valley needed at least one person who arrived before the story did and hasn't already decided which version to believe. So yes, I fought. She met his eyes. You can be angry about it later. Gideon looked at her. The room was very still. Then he looked at Frank. Thursday, he said. What time does Webb call the meeting? 7 o'clock. The church hall. I'll be there. Frank nodded and reached for his hat. I'll spread the word quietly, not through Crane's people. The Sorensens, the Breckenridges, the Kemper family, they've been waiting for something to shift. They'll come. He left. The door closed. The room was abruptly smaller with only 2 people in it. Rosalind began gathering the papers from the table. She felt him watching her not the way men sometimes watched women, with the specific quality of appraisal, the way you watched something you were trying to fully understand before it was gone. Rosalind, his voice was quiet. She stopped gathering papers. I haven't thanked you, he said. You've also told me to go home approximately 4 times. That's not the same as not being grateful. She set the papers down and looked at him. In the firelight, with the controlled expression dropped further than she'd yet seen it. He looked exactly his age, not old, not diminished, but marked, the way land was marked by weather, not weakened, shaped. Every place I stay eventually gets hurt, he said. It was what he had said to her outline weeks ago, the line she had turned over in her mind a dozen times. But now he was saying it differently, less as a statement, more as a question he was putting in front of her. You don't destroy everything you touch, she said. You save things. You've just been so long inside the story Crane built that you've started believing parts of it yourself. His jaw tightened. Not defensively. Something more honest than that. There were 7 men, he said. 7 soldiers, their families. He stopped. I made the right decision that night. I know that. I've always known that. But knowing a thing is right doesn't make it clean. No, she said. It doesn't. I carried it because I could, because I didn't have anyone who would bear the cost with me. She did not say anything. The fire settled. I'm not asking. He stopped again. Recalibrated. I don't expect you. To Gideon, she said it the way he had said her name that first time, with the weight of someone who had been careful with words for a long time and was choosing to put this one down directly. Stop deciding in advance what I will and won't do. He looked at her. A long moment. It's a habit, he said. Break it. Something moved through his face, not quite a smile. But it's structural precondition. The place where a smile comes from when a man has remembered that he is capable of one. The meeting is Thursday, she said, picking up her coat. Between now and then, do not go anywhere alone that isn't your own land. Crane's foreman is watching and Crane is moving, and I don't want to build all of this only to have some part of it undone by something preventable. You're giving me instructions now. I'm giving you sensible advice. You can decide what to call it. She was at the door when he spoke again. What happens if it doesn't work, he asked. If the meeting goes wrong? If Crane's document, whatever it is enough to discredit the Goss statement? She turned. He was standing in the middle of the room, looking at her, with the directness of a man asking something real, not something rhetorical. Then we find the next thing, she said. There is always a next thing when the truth is on your side. She walked back to town. The cold had an edge to it that it hadn't had that morning. And the sky to the north was the color of iron. She thought about Thursday. About Crane sitting at his desk. About the document he was composing that she still could not name. She was 200 yards from the boarding house when Webb stepped out of the general store and called her name. She stopped. He crossed the road to her with his coat collar up and his expression doing something complicated. I need to speak with you, he said. Not here, then where? My office. Now, if you're willing. She followed him upstairs. He closed the door and did not offer coffee this time. He stood at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and his face carrying something she had not seen there before, not the careful neutrality of previous conversations. Something disrupted, something that had been moved against its will. Crane came to see me this morning, he said, after your friend Harlow was seen coming into town. What did he want? He wanted me to deliver you a message. Webb looked at his hands. He has obtained a document. He intends to present it at Thursday's meeting. He already knew about the meeting. Which means his people told him, before Frank Harlow had finished spreading the word. Rosalind felt the cold that had nothing to do with weather. What document, she asked. A discharge record, Webb said. From the Army. He's claiming, and he has paperwork to support it, that Gideon Ashford was formally court-martialed in 1869 and dishonorably discharged. He's saying the Goss statement is the account of a man defending a convicted deserter and that it carries no legal standing. The room tilted slightly. A dishonorable discharge, she said carefully. That's what he claims. He has the paper, Rosalind. He showed it to me this morning. It looks real. She sat down, not from weakness, from the need to think without the distraction of standing. A court-martial she had not known about. A dishonorable discharge. If it was real, it would do exactly what Crane intended: poison the Goss statement at the source. Give the Valley a reason to distrust the entire account. Reframe Goss as a loyal friend, defending a convicted man rather than an honest witness, describing what he saw. Did you look at the document closely? She asked. I saw it clearly. It had the Army seal. The date, the charge: unauthorized breach of defensive position, resulting in the deaths of 7 soldiers under his command. Who signed it? Webb stopped. What? The court-martial finding. Who was the presiding officer? What name was on the signature line? Webb thought back. A colonel. I saw the seal and the dates and Ashford's name. I didn't examine the signature specifically. Rosalind stood. I need to see that document. Crane won't give you. Not from Crane. She was already at the door. Gideon would know whether a court-martial actually occurred. If it did, he'd know who presided. And if that document is forged, why would it be forged? She turned. Because Crane's father was the commanding officers. Because any legitimate court-martial would have been presided over by a colonel unconnected to the Ashford case. And that colonel's name would be on record in the Army's own files. If Crane is presenting a document that doesn't match those files, it's because the document doesn't exist in those files. Webb stared at her. How do you know this? He asked. Because I wrote to the Army Records Office in Washington 3 weeks ago, she said. I requested Gideon Ashford's full-service record. Webb's mouth opened slightly. I haven't received a response yet, she continued. But if Crane's document shows a court-martial that the Army's own records don't confirm, then what he has is a forgery. And presenting a forged document at a public meeting is not a legal strategy. It is a crime. She left Webb standing at his desk with the expression of a man watching a structure he had lived inside for years develop a crack that he could not stop seeing. She went directly to Gideon. She told him everything: the discharge document, Crane's plan for Thursday, the forged signature she suspected. She watched his face carefully as she laid it out. Because the way a man received information told you as much as the information itself. He did not look surprised. He looked confirmed. A court-martial, he said. There was no court-martial. You're certain? I resigned my commission in March of 1869. I walked into the garrison commander's office, a man named Colonel Harrison. Not Wyatt Crane, because Crane had been removed from command 6 weeks after the settlement incident for separate conduct violations. And I tendered my resignation in writing and walked out. He paused. There was no proceeding, no hearing, no presiding officer. I left. They let me leave because Harrison had already seen enough of what Wyatt Crane's command had looked like. And pursuing a formal action against me would have opened questions he didn't want open. So the document is forged. If it shows a court-martial, it's forged entirely. And Harrison, he died in 74. Crane would know that. The precision of it landed like something cold. Crane had chosen a forged document that named a dead man as the presiding officer. A man who could not be reached, could not be questioned, could not contradict the record. He had been planning this for longer than any of them had assumed. He built this as a contingency, Rosalind said. He had it ready in case someone ever came close enough to need stopping. He's had 15 years to prepare. Gideon's voice was flat. How do we prove it's forged before Thursday? The Army Records Office. She turned it over quickly in her mind. I wrote 3 weeks ago. If a response has been sent, it may already be in transit. But transit from Washington takes 10 to 14 days, and I may not have it in time. Then we need another way. There is another way. She thought of something she hadn't considered until this moment. The garrison records from 1869 would have been held at the fort itself. Fort Laramie. The fort still operates. The records office there would have a copy of every formal proceeding from that year, every court-martial, every discharge, every resignation. She looked at him. Telegraphic inquiry. Tonight, the telegraph office closes at 6. She looked at the clock on his mantel. 4:47. Then we need to move now. They reached the telegraph office with 9 minutes to spare. The operator, a young man named Aldous, who was clearly startled to see Gideon Ashford standing at his counter, took down the message Rosalind dictated without comment, because her voice had a quality in it that did not invite comment. The message went to Fort Laramie's records office. Request urgent confirmation. Court-martial proceedings. Sergeant Gideon Ashford, Cavalry. March 1869. Confirm or deny proceeding occurred and identify presiding officer if applicable. Response needed within 48 hours. Rosalind Avery, Blackwater Valley School. Wyoming Territory. She paid for the message. They walked out. 48 hours puts the response at Wednesday night, Gideon said. One day before the meeting, I know. And if the response is delayed, then we walk into that meeting Thursday with the Goss statement, and the fact that you resigned your commission and were not court-martialed. And we challenge Crane to produce his document publicly, where 40 people can examine it and where forgery has witnesses. She glanced at him. He does not want 40 witnesses to his forgery. They were halfway down the main road when a rider passed them at speed, Crane's foreman, going north toward the Crane property. He did not look at them. He did not need to. His presence on the road at this hour, at that speed, communicated everything. He knows we went to the telegraph office, Gideon said. Let him know. He'll try to interfere with the response. He would have to intercept a military telegraph communication. That is a federal offense. She paused. Even Crane has limits. She almost believed it completely as she said it. Almost. That evening she sat at her table and tried to read and could not. She was thinking about Thursday, the church hall. 40 people. Webb at the front. Crane in one of the forward chairs with his excellent coat and his unhurried smile. She was thinking about a forged document with a dead man's name on it. And she was thinking about the 48-hour window. And she was thinking about Gideon standing in her schoolhouse doorway with a bucket of whitewash, looking for a moment like a man who had forgotten he was allowed to do something quiet and good. She was also thinking, without particularly wanting to, about what he had said in the firelight. I didn't have anyone who would bear the cost with me. Past tense. She was thinking about whether she had heard that correctly and what she was supposed to do with it if she had. She was still thinking about it when Mrs. Garnett knocked and came in without waiting, which was unusual enough to bring Rosalind immediately to attention. There's a boy outside, Mrs. Garnett said. Her voice was strained. He came from the Harlow place. He says you need to come now. Rosalind was on her feet before the sentence finished. What happened? Crane's man came to the Harlow ranch this afternoon, Mrs. Garnett pressed her lips together. He delivered notice. Frank Harlow's land note has been called. Full payment. Due in 30 days. Rosalind stood very still. 30 days. Not the usual 60 or 90-30, which was technically within Crane's legal right but was, in practice, designed to be impossible to meet. Frank Harlow could not produce full payment in 30 days. No one in that family's position could. Crane had moved. Not on Thursday now. Before the meeting. Before the telegraph response. He was not waiting to lose publicly on Thursday. He was going to take the Harlow land before Thursday arrived, and make clear to every other landowner in that valley what the cost of cooperation looked like. Rosalind picked up her coat. Where are you going, Mrs. Garnett asked. To the Harlow place. She was already at the door. And then to Gideon. She stopped on the threshold. She turned back to Mrs. Garnett, a woman who had been careful and quiet and invisible throughout all of this, who had served Crane's guests in her boarding house and heard things she had never reported and watched things she had never named. Mrs. Garnett, Rosalind said, did you know about the 1,868 settlement? What actually happened there? The older woman was quiet for a moment. My husband was a soldier, she said at last. He died at Fort Kearny in 71. Before he died, he wrote me a letter. He mentioned a sergeant he had served with years before, a man who had done something difficult and right, and been blamed for it. He said, the man's name was Ashford. She paused. I have kept that letter for 12 years. Rosalind looked at her. Will you let me read it? Mrs. Garnett went to the cabinet in the corner of the room. She opened the bottom drawer. She came back with an envelope. old and soft with handling, and put it in Rosalind's hands. "I should have given it to someone sooner," Mrs. Garnett said quietly. "I was afraid of what it would cost." Rosalind held the envelope carefully. "It's going to cost something now," she said, "but for the right reason." She went out into the cold night with Mrs. Garnett's letter in one pocket, and everything still unresolved, and the meeting 2 days away, and Crane's move already in play. She walked fast, because there was no time left for any other speed. The stars above the ridge were very bright and very cold, and she looked up at them once as she turned north on the creek road and thought, "There are now 4 things: the Goss statement, the telegraph inquiry, Mrs. Garnett's letter, and the Harlow note called early. In the open, where everyone can see exactly what kind of man does exactly this kind of thing in the dark." She thought Crane made a mistake. He had been so certain of his own dominance that he had moved too fast and too visibly. And in doing so, he had handed her something he had never intended to give a provable act of retaliation, dated and documented, that any person in that valley could understand without legal training or historical context. He had not just called a land note. He had shown everyone watching exactly who he was. She walked faster. Part 5, the final secret, the monster who saved them all. The Harlow house was lit when Rosalind arrived. Catherine met her at the door with the expression of a woman who has received bad news and processed it into something harder than grief, something closer to resolve. Frank was at the table with a paper in front of him. The notice of early call on his land note, the ink still carrying the particular authority of a man who does not expect to be challenged. 30 days, Frank said without preamble. "I know." Rosalind sat down. "He moved early because he's afraid of Thursday. That notice is evidence of what he is." "Frank, not leverage evidence. Every person in this valley who sees it will understand what he did and why he did it. Understanding won't pay my note." "No. But I have something that might." She placed Mrs. Garnett's letter on the table beside the notice. A letter from a soldier who served in the Eastern Garrison, written to his wife in 1871. It corroborates Goss. It names Ashford by name as the man who acted rightly. She paused. "And there's more. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, I wrote to them 6 days ago requesting a review of Crane's consolidated holdings. If that review opens formally, Crane calling your note aggressively during an active investigation looks like interference with a government process." Catherine had moved to stand behind Frank's chair. Her hand rested on his shoulder. "He'll call 2 other notes before the week is out," Catherine said. "The Kempers, the Sorensens. He'll make an example of everyone who was seen talking to you. Then we move before morning." Rosalind looked at both of them. "I need you at the church hall by 6 tomorrow evening." "Not Thursday." "Tomorrow." Frank looked up. "The meeting isn't until Thursday. We're not waiting for Thursday. Webb chairs those meetings, but he doesn't own the church hall. Reverend Mills does. I spoke to the Reverend 2 weeks ago about using the hall for a school function. He gave me standing permission." She put both hands flat on the table. "Crane expects Thursday. He will use tomorrow to apply pressure to every family in this valley who might speak against him. We take tomorrow, 6 o'clock. We bring the Goss statement, Mrs. Garnett's letter, and every person we trust, and we hold our own meeting before Crane knows it's happening." The silence in the room was very specific, the silence of people recalculating, measuring risk against risk. "And Gideon?" Frank asked. "I'm going to him next." She left the Harlow house and walked the north road in the dark. No lamp. She had decided against it, because a lamp on the north road at night would be visible from Crane's property. And she had used up her patience for Crane's foreman and his watching. Gideon opened the door before she knocked. He had been awake, the lamp on the work table was bright, and the papers had been moved. He read her face before she spoke. "Crane called the note," he said. 30 days. Early call." She came inside. "We're moving the meeting to tomorrow. 6 o'clock, the church hall." He absorbed this without visible reaction for a moment. "Then who knows? The Harlows. You. By morning I'll have spoken to the Kempers and Pete Sorensen's father." She looked at him directly. "And I need you there. Not in the back. Not near the door where you can leave. At the front where they can see you." His jaw tightened. "Gideon." Her voice was not soft. It was clear and direct in the way of a woman who has run out of time for gentleness. You have been absent from your own story for 15 years. You have let other people tell it, shape it, weaponize it. Tomorrow night you stand in that room, and you tell them what happened on November 14th, 1868, in your own words, with your own name on it. Not through Goss, not through Frank. You. It will. She stepped forward. Because you are not the man they've been afraid of. You are the man who fixed Emmett Tanner's roof in the last light of an afternoon, without asking anyone to notice. You are the man who wrapped a horse's leg on the side of a road in the rain. You are the man who has been protecting people who are now ready to protect you. And the only person still refusing that protection is you. He looked at her. The lamp threw long shadows. The fire had gone down to coals. Why does it matter to you whether I stand at the front? He asked. Because the truth needs a face. She held his gaze. And because I am tired of watching a good man disappear himself. The room was very quiet. Then he said 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock. She walked back to town. The stars had shifted west and the cold had deepened, and she felt, for the first time since arriving in Blackwater Valley, the specific and clarifying fear of someone who has committed fully to something irreversible. Not regret. The clear-eyed recognition of her stepped off solid ground and is now entirely dependent on whether the thing she has built will hold. She slept 3 hours and was up before dawn. By 7 the next morning she had spoken to Martin Sorensen, who listened, asked 2 questions, and agreed to come. By 9 she had spoken to the Kemper family, who were already frightened about their own land note, and needed less convincing than she'd expected. By noon she had walked through the church hall with Reverend Mills, who was a quiet man in his 60s with the specific moral clarity of someone who had spent 40 years watching communities do both their best and their worst, and who asked only one question. Is the truth on one side of this? Mills asked. Clearly and documented, she said. Then the hall is yours. By 4 o'clock she had heard nothing from the telegraph office. She went to Aldous and asked directly. No response yet from Fort Laramie, Aldous said. He paused. But there was an inquiry on the line this afternoon. Someone tried to get access to the incoming message queue. Rosalind went still. Who? Aldous looked uncomfortable. I can't say who directed it. But the inquiry came through the commercial wire, not the military wire. Someone wanted to know if a response had come in for you, Crane. Or Crane's man. Watching the telegraph office the way he'd watched the schoolhouse. She thanked Aldous and walked out and stood in the road for a moment with the cold on her face, thinking about contingency. If the Fort Laramie response didn't arrive by 6, they went in without it. They had the Goss statement. They had Mrs. Garnett's letter. They had Frank Harlow's testimony and Catherine's and the called land note as evidence of retaliatory pressure. They had Gideon. It would have to be enough. At 5:30 she went back to the telegraph office. Aldous looked up when she came in and his expression told her before he spoke. 20 minutes ago, he said, and handed her the message. It was from Fort Laramie's records office. Official. Exactly what she needed. Re-inquiry dated October 21st. 1883. Army records confirm. No court-martial proceedings initiated against Sergeant Gideon Ashford. Cavalry, 1869. Service record shows voluntary resignation of commission. March 14, 1869. Accepted and recorded by Colonel D. Harrison, Fort Laramie. No dishonorable discharge issued. No formal disciplinary proceeding of any kind. Record is clean. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her inside coat pocket next to the Goss statement and Mrs. Garnett's letter, and she walked to the church hall. The hall was already half full when she arrived. 43 people by the time 6 o'clock came, more than she had expected. Fewer than she had hoped. The Harlow family in the third row. The Kempers and the Sorensens along the left wall. Emmett Tanner in the front without being asked, his hat on his knee. Mrs. Garnett near the back, straight-backed and still. Harlan Webb standing to one side with the expression of a man watching history occur and not yet certain which side of it he would end up on. And Bartholomew Crane in the second row, his coat immaculate. His hands folded in his lap, his expression carrying a calm that Rosalind recognized immediately as the calm of a man who believes he has already won and is waiting for the formality of proof. He had come. She had not expected that. She had expected him to stay away and send word. He had come because he believed his document would end this before it started. Reverend Mills opened the meeting and gave it to Rosalind without preamble. The way a man gave something to someone he trusted to carry it well. She stood. The room settled. "I want to thank you for coming on short notice," she said. "I'll tell you why the notice was short. 3 days ago, a land note was called early on the Harlow family 30-day full payment. No prior indication, no change in the Harlow's account status. The call came the same afternoon Frank Harlow was seen speaking with me. She let that settle. In 30 years of professional life, I have learned that timing is rarely coincidental." A murmur. Crane's expression did not change. "I am going to read 3 documents," Rosalind continued. "Then I am going to ask Gideon Ashford to speak. Then you can ask whatever questions you have. And you can make whatever decisions you make as a community. But I ask that you hear everything before you decide." She read the Goss statement first. All of it, every sentence, every specific detail of November 14th, 1868. The room changed as she read. She could feel it changing. The way a room felt when the temperature dropped, not dramatic. Not sudden, but undeniable. She heard Crane shift in his seat when she reached the part about Colonel Wyatt Crane's order. He shifted once and then went still. She read Mrs. Garnett's letter second. The dead soldier's handwriting, 11 years old and perfectly clear, naming the sergeant who had broken the line and brought 4 civilians out alive. When she finished, she heard someone in the back of the room exhale a long, slow breath, the sound of a person releasing something they'd been holding. Then she read the Fort Laramie telegram. She read it slowly. Word by word. No court-martial proceedings, no dishonorable discharge. Record is clean. The room was completely silent. She folded the telegram. She looked at Bartholomew Crane. "Mr. Crane," she said, "I understand you have a document you intended to present at Thursday's meeting. A record of a court-martial and dishonorable discharge for Gideon Ashford, dated 1869. She kept her voice even. "The Fort Laramie Records Office states that no such proceeding occurred. I'd like to give you the opportunity to explain the document you have." Every head in the room turned toward Crane. He uncrossed his legs. He smoothed his coat. He looked at her with the smile still intact, but for the first time since she had met him. The smile was doing visible work. It was not natural anymore. It was being held. "A telegraphic inquiry from a schoolteacher is hardly a definitive record review," he said. His voice was still pleasant, still measured. "It's from the fort's official records office. Mr. Crane, records can be incomplete. In that case, you'll have no objection to a formal review by the Territorial Army Authority." The smile held for another 2 seconds. Then something behind it shifted very slightly, very deeply, and Rosalind knew, with the specific certainty of a woman who has watched the moment before a structure falls, that he knew he had lost this particular ground. He did not produce the document. He looked away from her toward Webb, toward the room at large, looking for the faces that had always tilted his direction, looking for the consensus he had maintained for 6 years. Some of the faces looked back, most did not, I think Crane said. And now his voice had a different quality, still controlled, but thinner, that this meeting has been convened irregularly and without proper notice, and I reserve the right to contest its conclusions through appropriate. "You called the Harlow note 30 days early," Martin Sorensen said from the left wall. Not loudly, but with the particular weight of a man who has been quiet for a long time. "I saw the notice. My wife read it. 3 days after Frank Harlow was seen talking to Miss Avery." He paused. "That's my neighbor's land. Land notes are a private financial matter. You hold my note too." Sorensen's voice was entirely calm. "And the Kempers. And the Tanners." He looked around the room. "How many notes does one man need to hold to call a valley his own?" The question sat in the air. It had been said plainly enough that it couldn't be unsaid. Crane was quiet, and then Gideon Ashford, who had been standing at the back of the room the entire time, walked forward. The room watched him come. He moved the way he always moved, unhurried, deliberate, carrying himself with the specific economy of a man who has never had the luxury of careless movement. He walked to the front, and he turned and he faced 43 people who had been calling him a monster for 6 years. and he stood there without flinching and without apology. And the silence was very complete. November 14th, 1868, he said. His voice was quiet but entirely clear. 9 o'clock in the evening. We had civilians inside the camp perimeter, under fire from 3 sides. Colonel Wyatt Crane ordered us to hold position. He paused. Those 4 civilians had names: Esther Colby, aged 31. Her daughter Margaret, aged 8. Franklin Harlow, aged 26. His wife Catherine, aged 24. Catherine Harlow made a sound in the 3rd row. Very small. Holding position would have left them where they were. I broke the line, we moved them out. 7 soldiers died in that movement. His voice did not waver. I have thought about those 7 men every single day for 15 years. I will think about them every single day until I don't have more days. He looked at the room. And I would make the same decision again, because the alternative was not holding a line. The alternative was watching 4 people die because a colonel didn't want to complicate his defensive position. He stopped. He looked at Crane directly. Your father gave that order, he said. You've spent 15 years making sure. No one could say so. I've spent 15 years letting you, because the people I saved were alive and I thought that was enough. He paused. It wasn't enough, because silence let the lie stand, and the lie let you hold this valley by the throat. And that ends tonight. The room was still, perfectly still. Bartholomew Crane sat in the 2nd row, with his hands folded in his lap, and his face gone to something Rosalind had not seen there before. Not fear, not anger, the specific and dreadful expression of a man, watching the architecture of a life's work come apart in one room in one evening, and knowing that nothing he could say would reassemble it. He stood, he was very quiet, he put on his hat. This isn't finished, he said. It was not a threat exactly. It was the statement of a man who has not yet accepted that something is over, even when every person in the room can see that it is. He walked out. His boots on the floor were the only sound. No one watched him go with the deference they'd have shown a week ago. They watched him go the way you watched weather, passing aware of the damage it had done. Glad to see the back of it. For a long moment the hall was completely silent. Then Emmett Tanner, in the front row, stood up. He was 71 years old, and his knees gave him trouble, and he stood anyway. And when he spoke, his voice was rough and direct. I'll say it plain, Tanner said. I signed Crane's petition 3 years ago. I signed it because I owed him money and I was afraid. I was wrong to sign it. He looked at Gideon. You fixed my roof last September. You didn't ask. You didn't tell anyone. You just did it. He cleared his throat. That's the kind of man I signed a petition against. I'm sorry for it. The word fell in the room with a weight that no formal pronouncement could have matched. Gideon looked at the old man. Something moved across his face, that same unguarded quality she had seen in the firelight. The expression beneath the controlled surface. He nodded once. It was enough. Then Martin Sorensen said, I want to know about the land notes. If Crane's holdings get reviewed by the territorial office, what happens to the notes currently held? Rosalind stepped back in. A review could result in required restructuring of consolidated holdings. It could mean notes being offered to other creditors at face value, or refinanced through the Territorial Development Office at regulated rates. She looked at the room. I am not a lawyer, but I know the right people to ask. And I will ask them. The meeting went another hour. Question, practical and specific, about the land notes, about the Goss statement, about the Army record, about what came next. Rosalind answered what she could. She referred what she couldn't to the right sources. She watched Webb in his corner lean forward at some point in the second half of the meeting and begin writing things down, dates, names, the specific language of the Fort Laramie telegram. A man who has decided to be useful. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the hall emptied. The Harlows were the last to leave. Frank shook Gideon's hand without words. Catherine put her arms around Rosalind briefly, which was not the kind of thing frontier women did without cause, and which meant considerably more because of that. Then it was just the 2 of them in the empty hall, and Reverend Mills quietly extinguishing the extra lamps, and the cold coming through the old walls. Gideon stood near the front. He was looking at nothing in particular, the middle distance of a man whose mind was still moving through everything that had just happened. sorting it, trying to find the right place for each piece. Rosalind picked up her coat. "You were right," he said. "About standing at the front." She looked at him. "I didn't think it would. I didn't know if it would change anything." He stopped. "Tried again. I've been so long inside the silence that I forgot what it felt like to just say a true thing out loud. How does it feel?" He was quiet for a moment. "Like putting something down that I forgot I was carrying." She walked toward him. Not fast, not with any particular intention she had named to herself. But she walked toward him the way you walked towards something you had been considering for a long time from a careful distance and had finally decided to approach directly. She stopped close enough that the distinction between appropriate and otherwise became relevant. "They called you a monster," she said, "because they only saw the scar." His eyes were very still and very direct. "I chose you," she said, "because I saw the man." The silence had a different quality now, not the silence of things unresolved, but the silence of things arriving at their right position. He reached out and took her hand, not tentatively, with the directness of a man who, having finally decided something, saw no reason to be unclear about it. His hand was rough and warm and entirely certain. "I should tell you," he said quietly, "that I am not an easy person. I had noticed that. I have 15 years of habits that won't all break quickly. I have 7 years of students who told me they couldn't learn," she said. "I'm not easily discouraged." He almost smiled, the full shape of it this time, unhidden. "Rosalind." He said her name the way he had said it by the firelight, with the same weight. "I don't know what this looks like." "Neither do I," she said honestly. "But I know what it isn't. It isn't a mistake." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he brought her hand up and held it against his chest, not dramatic, not performed. The gesture of a man who wanted her to understand something he didn't yet have the full words for. She understood it. 3 weeks later, Bartholomew Crane left Blackwater Valley. He did not announce his departure. He did not hold a farewell meeting or compose a final cordial letter. He was simply there, and then he was not. His house shuttered. His office above the general store dark, his foreman gone ahead of him with the horses. The Territorial Land Office review had opened formally, and 2 of Crane's Cheyenne lawyers had advised him privately that the forged discharge document, if produced in court, would constitute a criminal offense. He was a careful man. He had always known when to calculate the odds. He left the valley to its own reckoning. Harlan Webb spent the following month working with the Territorial Office to restructure the land notes Crane had left behind. 3 families refinanced. 2 others paid their notes outright from funds they'd been holding back, waiting for the moment when paying felt safe. The Harlow note was absorbed into a development trust, organized by Webb himself. Penance. Rosalind thought, but productive penance, which was the best kind. Edmund Goss came to Blackwater Valley in the spring. He was a short, broad-shouldered man of 63, with a neat gray beard and the handshake of someone who had spent years behind a counter and had strong opinions about the importance of a firm grip. He came on a Tuesday and stayed a week, and on his 3rd evening in the valley, he and Gideon sat at Gideon's work table until nearly midnight with a bottle of whiskey between them and no one else present. And what they said to each other was not recorded and was not anyone else's to know. But when Goss left on Saturday, he was straight-backed and clear-eyed, in a way that men sometimes looked when they had finally set something down. Gideon was different after that. Not transformed, he was still quiet, still spare with words, still the kind of man who fixed things without announcing it. But something had come out of its long compression. He laughed more often, and not only the short, surprised laugh she had first heard at the fence line. A fuller sound. The sound of a man who had remembered that he was permitted to find things genuinely good. In the summer of 1884, Rosalind's school added 3 new students and a second room, built by a crew of 6 men from the valley who showed up on a Saturday morning with lumber and tools and the specific cheerful noisiness of people doing something they'd wanted to do for a while. Gideon was among them. He did not lead the crew. He worked beside them. And no one made anything of it, which was exactly the right amount to make of it. On the day the room was finished, Lucy Garfield walked the length of it with her arms out, as if measuring it with her wingspan. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "It needed to be," Rosalind told her. We have more to teach and more people to teach it to. Lucy looked at her with the particular sharp-eyedness of a girl who would be formidable in 3 years and was already getting close. Are you going to stay? Lucy asked. Or do teachers usually leave when the school gets bigger? Rosalind looked across the unfinished room at the man who was fitting a window frame into the new wall, with careful hands and complete attention. I'm staying, she said. Gideon did not look up, but the set of his shoulders changed slightly a quiet, specific thing, the kind that a person who had been watching him for 8 months would notice, and a person who hadn't been watching him closely might miss entirely. Lucy noticed. 11-year-olds who were going to be formidable noticed everything. She went back to measuring the room with her arms and said nothing, which was a remarkable act of tact for someone her age. In the autumn of that year, when the leaves on the cottonwoods had gone again to old brass and the first cold had come off the ridge, Gideon asked Rosalind to walk with him to the north end of his property. Not dramatically, the way he did most things directly, without ceremony, as though it were simply the next reasonable thing. They stood at the boundary of his land where the creek turned east, and he said, I have been thinking about what to do with the north parcel. The railroad survey came back. The spur will go through the east edge, not the full parcel, which means the rest of it is land. Just land, she agreed. Land that could be used. He looked at it. There's enough flat ground on the upper section for another building. Something permanent. Something that would outlast any one person's presence here. She waited. The valley's children are going to need more than one room in another 3 years, he said. And a school built on its own land, deeded in perpetuity to the district, can't be taken away by anyone with a land note. She looked at the upper section of the parcel. She looked at him. You want to deed your land to the school district, she said. Part of it. Enough for a proper building. He was quiet for a moment. It's not my name I want on it. I don't need that. But I want it to exist. I want those children to have a place that no one can call a note on and walk away with. She looked at him for a long time. They called you a monster, she said softly. Some still do. He turned to face her. That's all right. The ones who matter stopped. She put her hand against his face, the scarred side, the side that people noticed first and interpreted without asking. He did not move away from her hand. He went very still in the way he went still when something landed somewhere unguarded. And then he covered her hand with his and held it there. I'm not an easy person, he said again. The same words from the church hall. But now they were not a warning. They were something more like an honest offering. Here is what I am. The whole of it, take it or leave it. No, she said. But you're a good one. The valley spread out below them, brown and cold and heading into winter, with the creek glinting in the last of the afternoon light and the ridge going dark above it. Somewhere down the road, the sound of children, her children. Lucy Garfield's clear voice rising above the others. Asking something, always asking something. Gideon Ashford had spent 15 years inside a story that was not his. He had kept other people's secrets at the cost of his own name, and he had called that protection, and it had been, but it had also been a kind of vanishing. A slow and deliberate disappearing, and the man who had done the vanishing was still present underneath it. Still whole, still capable of the kind of loyalty that could last 15 years and still be standing when it was finally found. The school was built the following spring. It sat on the upper section of the north parcel. Solid and properly framed, with windows on 3 sides and a wood stove that could heat the room from October through April. The deed was registered with the Territorial District Office under the name Blackwater Valley Common School, held in perpetuity, not subject to private land transaction. On the wall beside the door, a plain wooden board, carefully lettered by a man who had not thought his hands were suited to fine work and had been wrong. It read, built for the children of this valley in the belief that truth, given time, finds the people brave enough to speak it. No name, no date, just the words and the room behind them, and the children who filled it each morning, without knowing exactly what it had cost to build, which was precisely as it should be. Lucy Garfield walked past that board every day for the next 7 years, until she was 18 and left for Teachers College in Cheyenne, carrying with her the habit of a woman who had been taught, from the beginning, that the most important thing she could do with a question was not to answer it too quickly. She became a teacher. She came back. She always came back. And the valley, which had once believed a simple story, because simple stories were easier to hold, learned over time to hold the more complicated one, the one about a man who had broken a line in the dark to bring 4 people out of fire, and had paid for it with his name, and had never once asked to be thanked for it. The world may judge a person by the story it hears. But love, the specific, clear-eyed, undramatic kind, has the courage to find the truth behind the silence, and to say it, out loud, with its name on it. That is the kind of love that builds things that last.